Chapter 2, The Ties That Bind. Narcotics Anonymous is a program of action, not theory. We don't think our way into a new way of living. We live our way into a new way of thinking. Before we got clean, our identity was built on fantasy. Who we could be, would be, should be, or even who we used to be. In recovery, we connect with reality through action. We show up and do our part. We experiment with jobs, relationships, and service commitments. Some of us begin simply trying to keep a houseplant alive. Wherever we start, each of us ventures out into the world, clean, and tries something new. We learn who we are by taking a stand, taking risk, and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. Even when we make mistakes, we can learn something vital about ourselves. We identify as addicts, and the principle of anonymity teaches us that this is the most important thing. If we forget we have a deadly disease, it doesn't really matter who or what else we think we are. But once we are clear about that, and get used to the idea of being clean, all kinds of possibilities open up to us. As recovering addicts, we are free to explore the world and to consider who we are and who we want to become. An experienced member suggested that the whole trick to living is figuring out who we are and doing it on purpose. Connection to ourselves. It can take a long time to set ourselves free. When we come to recovery, we have been devastated in many ways. Although living clean isn't all about crisis, it can sometimes seem that way. Our feelings are so powerful. There is so much change in our lives, and change can be messy even when it's positive. Our personalities and our sense of who we are were warped by our addiction, and when we get clean, we are even more confused. It can be a while before we have the opportunity or the need to ask, okay, who am I now? We change in recovery, but we also uncover who we were all along. We find ourselves. For many of us, this is the restoration second step talks about. It may even be a restoration to a state we've never experienced before, because we've never had the chance to be ourselves without pretending, without hiding, without trying to be something else. There may be many different ways we describe ourselves, and the ones that seem most important can change depending on where we are in our lives. Identity is a confusing word. It indicates the things that make us different from each other and the things that make us exactly the same. Our identity is composed of the things that distinguish us either as part of a group or as separate from it. We are as different as our stories, but our literature reminds us that addiction makes us one of a kind. At some point, our identity as addicts came to define us. At the end of the road, it seemed like we were nothing but our addiction. As we stay clean, we begin to discover who we are. Some of us return to identity we once knew and had lost. Others of us come into the process uncertain of who we might be. Experiences from our past can make it hard for some of us to see ourselves in new ways. The labels we have applied to ourselves don't allow us to change. Powerful emotional experiences can shape our identity. Sometimes they seem to define us. Those experiences made us who we are, and we embrace them. For that matter, we might not want to see ourselves otherwise. Sometimes we are simply stuck in unresolved past experiences like abuse, prison, or the death of someone we love. How do we reconcile with who we have been with who we are becoming in recovery? We want to be free from our past without missing any opportunities to learn from it. Sometimes it can take a while for our sense of ourselves to catch up with who we are. We may even sabotage ourselves to return to familiar chaos or pain when our lives start seeming too different from what they had been. Gradually, we learn that much of our unmanageability we struggle with is the result of the choices we make. When we begin to get comfortable with new choices, our lives change, sometimes radically. What makes us happiest are the things that may never have occurred to us to want. Some of us have the experience of lost dreams awakening, picking up our desires where we left them, and finally living the lives we had always wanted. Others of us find that the dreams we left behind no longer fit the people we have become. We come in with a regrettable history of broken promises and broken dreams, of dishonesty, betrayal, and failure. Believing we are worthy of the things we want can be its own process. We may have been afraid to dream at all. Some of us punish ourselves in recovery for years, holding ourselves back from joy because we feel we don't deserve it. The tools and the love we find in NA can help us break these patterns, no matter how long we have been living with them. We can get stuck in patterns so quickly. Vigilance is necessary to keep old patterns from resurfacing. Something needs to break the circuit of our negative thinking. It may be an action we take, like meditating or going to a meeting. It may be an action someone else takes. Our friends and sponsors come to know us well enough to recognize when we are off course and help us to make a shift. When we are living just for today, we find courage that we never expected, and we can go forward into our lives with joy, excitement, and great hope for what is possible. But when we dwell in the past or worry about the future, we find ourselves trapped again almost before we know what happened. There is no single, easy answer to how we make peace with our past, and it rarely happens all at once. Throughout our recovery, different pieces of ourselves become available to us, and other parts are ready to be let go. Sometimes this is a peaceful process, and sometimes it's terrifying. The fact that something does not get resolved in one round of steps or in a few conversations with our sponsor does not mean we are not progressing. Returning again and again in step work or in dreams to the scene of the crime is part of the experience many of us share in recovery. Each step we work gives us back a piece of ourselves and relieves a little of our burden of regret, shame, and fear. We let go of some things we believed about ourselves and find others. We return to some of the things we once cherished and find out if they still suit us today. The ways we change can be surprising. We leave pieces behind along the way. It is almost like a child's game. With each step forward, we must turn around and retrieve a piece of our past. Defects of character are removed, but other things are as well. We change jobs and find out how much our identity was tied up in what we did for a living. Or we experience a change in our relationship and find that it changes us in other ways as well. This can be upsetting. We may not want to admit that what worked for us yesterday is no longer in our best interest. As we start to know ourselves, we may be afraid to keep growing because it opens up the possibility that we might lose the self we have only just gotten to know. Experience teaches us that the more willing we are to move forward in our lives, the more fully we become ourselves. We learn what is true for us by going through difficulty, staying clean, and looking back on the experience. We may think we are the ones being tested, but the reality is that we are continually testing our faith and understanding against our experience. When we go through difficulty and recovery, it can feel like we are in the same place we were before we got clean. And while sometimes we recreate old experiences in our new lives, more often we mistake a temporary difficulty for a permanent condition. The simple act of accepting ourselves changes us. We start treating ourselves better as we respond to the world with a new humility. The basic text says in the 8th step, we want to look the world in the eye with neither aggressiveness nor fear. As we clean up our wreckage and live differently, we can respect our actions and find respect for ourselves in the process. Part of the charm of many of our more experienced members is that they can seem so eccentric. One suggested that this was a consequence of no longer having defenses in the way. More and more we are comfortable just being ourselves. We appear in the world exactly as we are. That freedom is part of the promise of our 3rd tradition. Because we have only one requirement for membership, the desire to stop using, we are given permission to be who we are. We no longer have to lie to gain acceptance. Connection with a higher power. Many of us notice when we first come to meetings that members who are recovering and happy with themselves seem to shine. That light of the Spirit is the most beautiful thing we have to offer, and is less fragile than we think. After all, it survived our addiction. Dimming that light is partly about nurturing the passion inside us, and partly a process of trimming away all the stuff that hides us from ourselves. Our defects grow in the dark. In the light of recovery, our assets begin to blossom. There is more than one way we understand the phrase, practicing these principles. We practice and we don't always get it right. The basic text tells us in the 6th step, we learn that we are growing when we make new mistakes. Regular practice, beginning with the basics and gradually progressing from there, is exactly how we get good at anything, from learning to play an instrument or speak a new language, to learning how to live a spiritual, principled, and rewarding life. We are not just learning new skills, we are breaking old habits. Some are so deeply ingrained that they feel like a part of who we are. Building a relationship with something greater than ourselves is a project we undertake the first time we approach the steps, and it continues throughout our recovery. For some of us, spiritual disciplines, including prayer and meditation, shape our day. Others of us try to live our lives as a prayer, offering all of our actions as gifts to our higher power. However we practice or experience it, our relationship with our higher power comes to shape our understanding of who we are and how we relate to the world around us. Our actions and motives reflect our values and beliefs. When we are in tune with a power greater than ourselves, we seem to flow more easily with the currents in our lives. After years clean, we experience ourselves differently than we did in the beginning. As we develop an identity beyond addict, we wonder whether the label still applies, whether we still belong in the fellowship. We tend to learn balance by bouncing off both extremes. Questioning our relationship with NA can take it to a deeper level. The answers we find can help resolve our new reservations, and the security to question our foundation is part of the secret to solidifying it for a lifetime. It is said that those wishing to discover a new land must spend a long time at sea. Sometimes when we feel like we are lost at sea, we may wonder whether the program still matters for us. We are afraid to doubt because we know it can kill us, but the fear of questioning our new way of life can lead us to be dishonest with ourselves. NA isn't about learning to be compliant. It's about establishing a relationship with something greater than ourselves, and often that relationship can be a little stormy. It is important to know that there are members who will give us space to question our recovery, but don't quite let go of us either. Though some people will be unsure how to respond to our doubt, sharing our feelings can help us to see that we are not alone. In moments of extreme uncertainty, fake it till you make it is exactly the wrong perception, even though it may work just fine at other times. We need to be brutally honest with ourselves about what we feel and what we believe. Out of these moments of doubt can grow a faith that is truly our own. We can neither deny nor indulge these feelings. They must be handled with care. We learn what is true for us, and that sets the direction for our lives. Our moral compass is the product of work we do to understand and apply spiritual principles. When we move away from what we know is right, we feel frustrated and trapped. When we forget what is true for us, we lose our way and drift dangerously. On the other hand, when our understanding of the truth is changing, we may feel much more lost than we actually are. The compass is very much at work and is leading us in the new direction. Through these periods of grave doubt and uncertainty, we find a new surrender, a deeper faith, and often a very different sense of who we are. We run back to our old ways for fear we may become someone we don't recognize or won't even like. Some of us fear that if we go all the way inside, what we will find is nothing. But the emptiness we once feared gives us space for growth and change. We stop trying so hard to recreate ourselves and simply allow it to happen. As we work our way through those layers, we find safety, clarity, and confidence that no matter what happens, we don't have to lose ourselves again. There are some questions we can only answer alone, but in order to face those questions alone, we need the support of people we trust. The difference between solitude and isolation is another fine line we identify through experience. One question we learn to ask ourselves is, am I acting in the service of a greater good right now? We may need to be alone to connect with our higher power. Sometimes the best thing we can do is to rest, unwind, read a book, or watch a movie and let go. This is not the same as isolation, though the difference may not be apparent to anyone else. The difference is inside. We come to identify for ourselves what is restorative time alone and what is destructive withdrawal. Acceptance of our changing spirituality is part of our personal evolution. If our relationship with a higher power is real and meaningful, of course it will change over time. But sometimes this feels like a crisis. If we surrender, it drives us back to the steps, and revisiting steps 2 and 3, we can find a relationship to faith that makes more sense to us. As our values change, our beliefs are likely to develop as well. Letting go of the idea that we have to understand why things happen or how it all works frees us to have a spiritual experience without wondering if we're doing it right. Action is not always visible. Sometimes in order for us to move forward, we must stand very still. Meditation can be hard because it can be so uncomfortable to be quiet with ourselves, to simply stand in the moment and be present. But this is where we ask for help, listen for answers, look ourselves in the eye, and see who we are, where we are, and how we are. We can be still and observe without judgment. We are given the clarity to see what is right for us and what is not. We learn to trust our process and allow it the time it needs to work. When we set timelines on how well we should be, or how long we will agree, be afraid, or not know the answer to a question, we set ourselves up to believe that recovery isn't working. Recovery works very well, but not always on the schedule we set for it. There is no substitute for time. A lot of the step work we do after the first time through is about clarity. Listening to the voice within that tells us when what we're doing is right and when it's not in line with our values. Each time release more of what ties us to false expectations and beliefs about who we are. We are no longer contained by our addiction or our old narrow view of what life is supposed to look like. We learn that the power we gain in the 11th step is available to us when we are doing our higher power's will and living in self-acceptance. The biggest changes in recovery often happen when we're not looking. We wake up and find ourselves in lives we hardly recognize as our own. We find stability, dignity, and honor in our dealings with others, where once we saw struggle, degradation, and alienation. We gain self-respect when we follow through on commitments. These may begin with group service commitments, making coffee, chairing a meeting, and so forth. As our ability to follow through begins to grow, we take on larger challenges. Perhaps the biggest one is following through on our commitment to work the steps. One of our members suggests that it's not just the work we do in the steps, but the way we work the steps that sets the pattern for our lives. Taking on a big project in little pieces, working constantly on something that is important even when it is hard or unpleasant, teaches us different things than we learn by pushing through in a rush or working all night to meet a deadline. Through the steps, we peel back the layers of illusion that we mistake for ourselves. We learn that we have a disease, but that our disease isn't all we are. We learn that we are not God. We learn that we are not our past or our defects of character. We notice when we are confusing how we are for who we are. As we work our way deeper and deeper through the illusions, some of us wonder what will be left. We talk to members we respect and trust, and they remind us that working a program is not going to turn us into anyone other than who we truly are. As we develop a conscious contact with a power greater than ourselves, we grow into the awareness that our higher power doesn't want an imaginary, idealized version of us. We come as we are, and we serve best when we are most fully ourselves. The simple act of being present without trying to pretend works to peel away the distortions and lies, our defects, our baggage, and our nagging sense of inadequacy. We learn who we are precisely when we forget ourselves in service to others. Connection to the world around us. We build our foundation in recovery. As we become more secure, we broaden our horizons and accomplish goals we would never have considered before. Many of us go back to school, pursue careers, and start families. We come back regularly to check our foundation for cracks and shifting, and to reinforce it where needed. Such a sturdy foundation would not be necessary if we were just pitching a tent, but we build skyscrapers on our foundations. Those skyscrapers must be securely grounded so that renovating one room doesn't cause the entire structure to collapse. The tools we use to build our foundation are not the only tools we need later on. It's not that they lose their value. The basics are always important, but at some point they may not be enough to sustain us. When we arrive at a moment when everything we know is not enough for us, we turn to members with more experience. We are likely to get the same simple guidance we have heard from the beginning. The answers are in the steps. A deeper relationship with the steps continues to develop even after we have worked them many times. For some of us, constant practices of prayer, meditation, writing, or physical exercise are useful in the beginning but grow richer over time. The simple fact of having maintained a practice for a long time offers a structure for our program that we can depend on. For many of us, getting and staying clean is our greatest accomplishment, no matter what else we do in life. For others, it is the most beautiful gift we have been given. It is not always possible for us to share the thing for which we are most grateful with people outside recovery. They may feel like a little barrier between us and the world. Some of us stay entirely within the sphere of recovery. All of our friends are in recovery. A whole world is tied up with the fellowship, not because we are afraid to venture out, but because we derive so much satisfaction from the rich interactions we have in NA. The way we share, this level of deep identification that makes NA feel so special to us, talking openly about our feelings, finding humor in some of the darkest, most frightening things that have happened to us, is not always available outside the rooms. For some of us, that's fine. We are happy making our lives in NA. For others, creating outside the rooms the same kinds of intimacy and community that we have learned to love in recovery presents an exciting challenge. We may experience some kinds of connection in NA and other kinds in other places, with our families, religious communities, co-workers, or neighbors. We are comfortable having some of our identity here and some there. Each of us finds the blend that works for us just for today. Self-acceptance for most of us means finding a balance between our recovery and our lives outside NA. There are times when we are not around the fellowship as much as we would like to be. We notice a difference in our recovery. We may also notice a difference in how it feels when we come back. When we are not as closely connected, it's easy to feel left out. People ask where we've been and we take offense. We can be in grave danger when we start feeling angry at meetings because people are not responding to us the way we like. The tools of this program can become weapons if we choose to use them that way. Even our step work can become an opportunity for us to abuse ourselves about our imperfections. Some members say that our defects are just survival mechanisms that stopped working. Likewise, our best tools sometimes grow from our worst defects of character. We swing from self-obsession to intensive work on our recovery and gradually find a balance between these extremes, spending more time closer to the center as we practice. When we hit our thumb with a hammer, our sense of proportion changes and it feels like our thumb is enormous. We think about every movement in relation to that thumb and whether anything might touch it. The same is true of our egos. When we are damaged or hurt in some way, we feel larger than life. Every conversation seems to be about us. Humility is about discovering a sense of proportion firmly grounded in reality. We gain a better perspective of how much space we actually occupy. We discover that we are neither as big nor as small as we might think. We are important in the lives of the people around us, but that doesn't mean they are always thinking about how their actions will affect us. Self-obsession is rooted in fear. One of the deepest fears many of us share is that we will lose ourselves entirely. We are afraid to let go of what we know about ourselves in order to change, afraid to let go of our sense of ourselves in the world in order to meditate, afraid to let go of our beliefs about our place in the world for fear we will never fit anywhere. For many of us, letting ourselves go may be the first step towards finding ourselves. We don't have to hold on so tight. One of our members shares that when I turn it over but don't let go, I'm just upside down. Letting go gives us the freedom to write ourselves again, naturally and gradually, rather than forcing ourselves into a mold of how we think we ought to be. We struggle with self-obsession throughout our lives. This is not a defect we let go of just once. It comes up again and again. Often a feeling will send us into self-obsession. Addiction is a disease that distorts ideas and attitudes. When we practice acceptance, we distance ourselves from our reactions and reflexes. This gives us the ability to see more of the picture than our limited point of view allows. The Serenity Prayer is a tool we use again and again in our recovery. Considering what we can change and what we cannot becomes increasingly powerful. Connection to others. Some days it seems really easy to identify with others, to feel welcomed and welcoming in a meeting. At other times, all we hear are the things that set us apart from the group. When we start noticing the differences more than appreciating our similarities, it's usually a red flag indicating discomfort with ourselves. When we focus on the personalities of others, we may gossip, bicker, and contribute to disunity. When we focus on our own personality, we quickly become self-centered and self-obsessed. When we focus on living the will of our higher power and carrying the message, our identities grow and flourish. The 10th step offers us ample opportunity to tend to that development, nurturing the growth we want to encourage and pruning back the wayward branches before they grow out of control. When we attend meetings regularly, people get to know us and see us over time. When a fellow member can point out to us, you always get depressed at this time of year, we can take action to address a pattern we could not see ourselves. When someone we don't know that well points out our generosity or loving kindness, we learn that people see goodness in us that perhaps we don't see in ourselves. Our fellows reflect us back to ourselves and show us how we have changed. Practicing compassion helps us to stop comparing ourselves to others. We start seeing the deep connections and similarities between us. Our traditions teach us that we are all equal. This doesn't mean we're all the same. Our differences are striking and sometimes very entertaining. Many of us have shared that part of what made us feel comfortable in our earliest meetings is that there are so many different kinds of people in a single meeting sharing and appearing friendly with one another. This can contrast sharply with what we have experienced before, in or out of active addiction. The things that separate us in the outside world do not matter in NA. The disease does not discriminate, and neither should we. We know this is true in principle, but it is sometimes a struggle in practice. Some patterns of prejudice and discrimination are so deeply woven into the fabric of our lives that we don't even notice them. On the other hand, if we have had a lifetime of experience dealing with oppression or discrimination, we may be so conscious of its signs that we see it even where it does not exist. For some of us, hearing our story or identifying is all about finding someone who shares our background or beliefs. Not experiencing that right away can be frustrating or frightening. I can see it works, some of us have said, but not for someone like me. When other members tell us our need for that companionship is overstated, we don't feel welcomed. We feel even more invisible. However, many of us have found that despite our initial discomfort, we do thrive in a diverse fellowship. We notice at first that we need addicts who share and understand our sexual identity or our heritage, for example. Later we find that we need even more to have members around us who really understand us, no matter what we share. We may be surprised by the members whose stories we relate to or with whom we feel comfortable talking. It's uncomfortable when we feel like the only one of our kind in a meeting, but that can give way to a larger sense of connection. We learn to accept and love who we are, whether or not we feel like we match the people around us. We learn to identify with people on other levels, whereas before we might not have even tried. Many of us come to keep an eye on the door, paying special attention to newcomers who might feel like the only. In many local NA communities, it has taken a few members who stick around through that sense of isolation to create a community that is large and diverse. One or two very young addicts in a meeting make that meeting feel safe for the next young person who walks in, and so on. We learn that what once felt like a reason to isolate is actually one more reason why it's important that we're here. We are uniquely qualified to carry the message to the addict who sees him or herself in us. We never know what will make someone feel a connection with us. When we sense a connection based on our shared disease and shared recovery, the ways in which we differ from one another become enriching rather than limiting. As we meet more people, attend conventions and events out of town, and connect with other members in service or online, our circle in NA grows, and we find people who share our experience. But more surprisingly, we find people who share our feelings, and even our sense of connection and disconnection, where we might never have thought to look for them. When we share our experience honestly, we give others the opportunity to relate to us and connect with us in spite of any surface differences. When we do the work of helping people get clean, something changes inside us. We discover the magic, the gift, when we see the light come on in someone's eyes. We learn to get out of our self-obsession. So many of our solutions are in service. We reap the rewards of our efforts as long as we keep coming back. The addict we reach out to in a moment of need may well be the person who saves our life later. There's a lot to be said for old-fashioned 12-step work. We can get confused and limit our outreach to members we know who have relapsed. We can be fearful of new people we don't know. Perhaps there is reason to be cautious. We're dangerous when we're using. We alibi out of caring by saying that we are making amends to ourselves. I don't need all that drama in my life. But when we protect ourselves from the newcomer, we don't defend our lives from drama. We deprive ourselves of the opportunity to witness the miracle. Sometimes what a new person needs most is just not to be alone. Simply allowing someone to be with us as we go about our lives can be priceless. We teach one another how to reach out. Just because someone did it for us doesn't mean we automatically know how to reach out to someone new. Bringing a sponsee along on a 12-step call gives them an opportunity to learn and keeps us from trying to do that alone. We learn to be in the presence of great pain without taking it in or taking it on. We feel deeply and experience our emotions at great extremes. We dive into life face first or hide under the covers, afraid to move. The price of growth for many of us is the awakening of more feelings than we know how to live with. It takes courage and humility to keep from shutting down again. Often, after the fact, we recognize that our negative thinking had cascaded. Perhaps we started with allowing a resentment to fester and found gradually that we were less honest. Withholding the truth gave way to lying, and then sharing got harder, and so forth, until we found ourselves dealing with the consequences of a whole lot of bad behavior. Addiction and recovery are both progressive. We are very rarely standing still. We are almost always either getting better or getting sicker. We define ourselves by our choices. The decision to have a family means leaving behind the independence we knew before. The decision not to have a family means that we must find other ways to feel connected to people, and so on. Tradition 7 tells us that everything has a price, regardless of intent, and we find the profound truth in that as we move forward in our lives and our recovery. Every choice we make, good and bad, means there were options we left behind. We can get lost in infinite webs of what if as we start thinking about our lives. The 4th step warns us about getting caught in the binge of emotional sorrow that can result. We come to see ourselves not as we were, but as we are becoming. NA helps us to live with the consequences and the benefits of our transformation. We all have experienced starting over in our lives with new people, places, and things, stepping into a new way of life we don't quite understand. The desire to survive and feel fulfilled is not unique to us as addicts, but in recovery we begin with connection to others and work our way to basic safety. And perhaps it has to be this way. To believe that we can trust the love in our lives is challenging. Those really deep needs are the ones we believe won't be met. It begins with the amends process, the understanding that we can forgive and be forgiven, that we can take responsibility for our actions and make better choices. Although our destinations may be different, our journeys are very similar. We travel through many identities before we find self-acceptance. We propel ourselves by using the tools we all share. When we are derailed, we end up in much the same place. When we are moving forward by practicing spiritual principles, we may go to very different places in our lives, but if we relapse, we end up in a common predicament. That is what we share most of all, not where we are going, but where we come from and how we move forward. Together we rise to the point of freedom. We need one another to get there, and one of the most beautiful things we do in the fellowship is support one another in pursuit of our dreams. Sharing our hopes and our successes is as much a part of carrying our message as sharing our fears and difficulties. We have a message of hope to carry. It's a gift and an obligation. We may not relate exactly to one another's dreams, but we can relate to the hope, energy, and excitement of trying to realize them. We are inspired by one another's journeys. Being present to one another's growth gives us the tools and inspiration to move forward ourselves. But we also find we are able to stay put, follow through, and live the lives we create. Our recovery is something we can trust and believe in. New beginnings are possible anytime we are ready.